Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're so excited to have our state treasurer, Shawn Wooden, joining us from his home in Avon. Not too far, but far because of Corona. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, really excited to have you. So I think that the best place for us to start is sort of a mini civics lesson because I think there's a lot of people who generally understand what treasurers do, but they may not understand what you do in your job. And I think it's important to point out, as I was reminded today, reviewing some of the materials I wanted to review about you and about your work, that you are the only statewide African American office holder in all of New England. You're the only African American treasurer in the United States of America, which is honestly shocking to me. And it shouldn't be, but it really knocked me back a bit. And I was just so struck by that and struck by, the place we find ourselves in now and the job that you're doing now. So if you would like to just share a little bit about what the treasurer is responsible for and how you've approached the position so far.
Sure. And again, thanks for having me and thank you for running. You had a close race last time and I think it's great that you're doing this again and would love to see you serve. And we would all benefit from that. As state treasurer, I say I'm responsible for the ABCs in Connecticut, our assets, our borrowing, and our cash. And that encompasses a number of things. And I sit on over 20 boards. Today I was with the Airport Authority, but things that most people don't think about. And so I always love to get that question. But in terms of our banking relationships, in terms of when we borrow money, I say I manage the state's credit card. And when we invest pension assets. And so all of that dealing with our financial and economic life in Connecticut is something that I'm involved with.
That's fantastic. And I did forget to say up top at the front of our evening that if anybody has any questions for Shawn, please put them in the comments. We're happy to get to those sort of at the end of our discussion, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone has a chance, if they have questions for you specifically about some of the work that you've been doing, that they have the opportunity to ask those questions. So I reread your op-ed on racial justice in terms of corporations today, and it was, your reaction to Ahmaud Arbery, the father of two Black sons, as a Black man yourself. And I was so moved by it because it's from a different perspective in terms of talking about the responsibility of corporations. And it's interesting, even just this week, we saw nationally in Washington, D.C., this week, the Washington football team receiving pressure from their two main sponsors, FedEx and Pepsi, to change the name of their football team. And I say this as someone who has rooted for that team for a lot of my life. And then as an adult, once I became aware of what the name of that team really meant, it tainted it for me. And I think that's something that you really talked about in that op-ed about what the responsibility of corporations are.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? For me, in terms of writing that op-ed and even being moved to write it, as I was at the dinner table having a conversation with one of my sons who's a runner and talking about the death of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia and asking me whether it was still safe to go out and jog in our neighborhood. And that, hit me very powerfully and made me reflect on my experiences coming up and the challenges around race, and the fact that, my sons now are still living in an America where that question is something that comes up at the dinner table. That's not a conversation in America that any parent should be having.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of my personal call to action. I'm the treasurer and I deal with finances and billions of dollars here and there and a host of things, but confronting racial justice in this country is not something that was on my campaign platform. With that said, it is the moment that we find ourselves in, and I decided at that moment to use my voice, to use my experience to elevate this issue in a way that is unique. As you mentioned, I'm the only African-American elected state treasurer in the country. And I'm one of the national leaders of our state treasurers association as the secretary treasurer, but
Treasurer squared.
Yes, the treasurer of treasurers.
Yes.
But it just hit me very powerfully that we as treasurers occupy a unique space of dealing with Wall Street and corporate America just on a daily basis. These are our business partners. And just being a student of history, I understood instinctively the role that corporate America could play in getting off the sidelines and leaning in to where we are in America. I call it our modern day Emmett Till moment. Yes. And for those who are unaware, Emmett Till, during the civil rights movement, he was a teenage boy from Chicago who visited his family in the summer in Mississippi and was lynched. And that's when that was publicized and America saw it, the mother insisted on an open casket funeral. But this galvanized the nation, and in particular, quite frankly, more white Americans to the cause. And I see that 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd's murder on video as that moment to galvanize. And I committed myself to lean into that moment with my business partners and those that I deal with every day and say, you've done good things in the past. When we look at ending apartheid in South Africa, it was corporate America that played a very constructive role along with others and with the economic boycotts, right, to bring South Africa. Now, when we look at LGBTQ rights, and the so-called bathroom bill in North Carolina, corporate America played a constructive role. When we look at more recently Mississippi and the flag and the Confederate symbol, once again, corporate America, more quietly in that case, but played a role. And so there's power in capital and money. And if it can be used for good and to help influence our country in a positive way, it's a good thing. And so I did the op-ed, I sent it to 400 executives, and it was republished, in Hawaii and Texas and Iowa and Ohio, just all over. And the response has been amazingly powerful from CEOs. And I've been engaged in conversations and now working on kind of convening them to say, what do we do beyond this moment, right? Beyond the protests, beyond the expressions of pain, what can we do to make things better? And I'm a lot of people are cynical about whether or not this is just a moment. And I happen to be hopeful that based on my conversations, there are people who really want to make change and make a difference and also see it, right? And as a treasurer, I never get too far from finance and economics, right? So it's notable that an economist from Goldman Sachs has gone on record publicly and saying, if we don't do something about systemic racism in our country, we're going to hurt our economy and our financial markets. It's notable. There's a McKinsey, one of the most prominent consulting firms in the world, that they've said, if we can close the economic disparities in our country, by 2028, we can increase our gross domestic product by 4 to 6%. That is significant. So that's my other message to corporations, is saying this is the right thing to do, but it's also good for our economy and for growth.
Absolutely. And I think that any country would jump at the chance to increase that by 46%. I mean,
Yes.
it seems like a small, but when you look at the numbers, it's a staggering amount. I guess I would also ask, as it's interesting when you say about sparking conversations. I mean, you and I both have sons in the same town, right? And so my son is only 10, sadly not a runner. I wish he was a runner, but it pains me to know that we're in the same town and your son felt the need to ask that question because I can picture him wanting to go for a run in the neighborhood or wanting to run, at a local track. So, I think that these are conversations that I certainly hope, or at least I am hearing from white friends that they are starting to also have these conversations. But I also personally have noticed, and I wonder what your thoughts are on how these conversations have changed in the media and how they've changed in terms of, when you say you're talking to CEOs, I feel like finally, it's not as if Black America was not saying that these things were happening. You brought up Emmett Till. We had a gentleman speak at our protest in Avon who was childhood friends with Emmett Till. The man is now 79. Wonderful art, Deacon Art. And I think about, there have been other moments. What do you think is making this moment different? Do you think that the conversations, to me, they sound more honest, almost
Mm-hmm.
like we white people are getting to eavesdrop on real conversations, as
Yes.
opposed to, I know the exhaustion that I have heard from many Black people about having to talk to white people about race. So what are the hopes or what are the thoughts around how the conversations are changing?
Yeah. So I think so. The first big question is: Is this a moment,
Right,
or is this more part of a larger movement?
right,
And a lot of people are asking that question.
right.
I instinctively felt like this was something more, and now the data is bearing that out. Right. Just to look at like there's been a lot of public polling on this, and Gallup poll shows that 70% of Americans believe we need to address police reform, uh, support Black Lives Matter movement.
Mm-hmm,
Now, 6 years ago, 6 years ago, when they did the same poll, it was around 43%.
mm-hmm.
They've said this is the fastest, most significant change in public opinion that they have ever seen since the beginning of Gallup polling.
That's amazing.
So there is a difference. A majority of Republicans, and another part of my message has been, whether it's to CEOs or to anyone listening, is that what we're talking about now, this is not a partisan moment. It should not be. This is an American moment.
Right.
Even when we talk about protest, that's as patriotic as you can get to elevate your voice, petition your government for change. And so I believe that the data supports, and I have felt it in my conversations. You mentioned a level of candor, honesty that we haven't seen before. And quite frankly, from everybody. As I wrote about it in my op-ed, that as a Black man, particularly a Black man in politics, right? But this is just generally honestly expressing the pain and frustration of what that means. And it doesn't go over well for most people, right? Because America felt like, well, we got past race. We had the civil rights movement.
We had Obama.
We had President Obama,
Right.
right? And so rather than appreciating that as a nation, we're on a journey, right? We're on a journey to realize our founding ideals as a
Mm-hmm.
country, right? And this notion of becoming a more perfect union, and we're zigzagging. And right, and we are at a moment now, in my view, where we can make some significant progress because of the level of awareness and just sensitivity towards this. It's never been at this level in my adult lifetime. The real question is, what are we going to do with it?
Right.
And where do we go from the very productive protests that we've seen. I was at a protest or a rally, and I mentioned protests across the country, and I was appropriately corrected by someone in the audience who said the globe, and they're right. When we look at Europe and we look at other places. So it is remarkable, this moment that we're in. And we, in my view, we ought to take this kind of outrage and this pain that we all feel collectively and turn it into opportunity and a common sense of purpose. And we need to channel it and make sure that it's beyond this moment. And we see what excessive police force looks like in real time. And, I want to talk about that, but with a global pandemic, and we see how COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted communities of color and higher infection rates, higher hospitalization rates, higher death rates. And you look at the structural issues that lead to that. Now, the sad news is that all of this has been hiding in front of us in plain sight for a very long time. But I say, let's focus on today and tomorrow. And now that more people see it, that gives us the opportunity as a community and a nation to address it. And I think that's great. The other really interesting thing about this moment is the fact that we are in a pandemic and so many Americans are at home, working from home or unemployed. And with the death of George Floyd, being able to watch that video, right? Like not just at the 11 o'clock news or on cable news late at night, but to see it all day and again and again. I think you had more people viewing this. And so it's a confluence of the moment of this tragedy happening, technology with video, and the ability of people to pay attention to it. It just produced this very unique spark of change. And I hope as a state, I hope as a nation, we don't let his death be in vain, in that we translate it into real change and start to look at economic disparities, start to look at healthcare disparities, housing disparities, educational disparities. That's where we need to see kind of the real change from a policy perspective. And that's what I'm looking forward to you being in the legislature to advance.
And certainly for all of us to, learn more about, so that you can act on appropriate policies that work, policies that are going to move the needle forward. It's so interesting, talking about George Floyd, and when you said about having to see it over and over again, I think it's also the not turning away from it, because this isn't the first time that we've seen. I mean, we can go back, Rodney King, I feel like, was one of the first really televised. I mean, that was that was brutal, but that was when you and I were certainly much younger. And I think about, that could have been a moment in time, but it wasn't a moment in time. And, when you go back to Emmett Till, and I actually recently watched a documentary about, the decision his mother made to make sure that there was an open casket because she wanted for everyone to be able to see. I think in some ways, hearing George Floyd calling out to his mother at the end, and as a mother, you don't have to be a mother to be moved by it, but certainly as a mother, I thinking of that poor man's final moments, it's incredibly moving and incredibly, it is sad that had to happen for us to be able to move forward on so many of these things when we've been told about them for decades and decades and decades, 401 years, frankly. So, it's that really is incredible. And I would also say, so in terms of your job and investing, what are some of the things, some of the, sort of good stewardship things around investing in certain companies versus not certain companies, those kinds of things that I know you've already worked on. What are some of the things that you would maybe want to highlight so far?
Yeah. So as a fiduciary, right, there are certain guidelines in terms of prudent investing. And as the trustee for our pension system, which is approximately 36 billion right now, I've got to make sure that I maximize a return on those investments and that I manage risk associated with it. So that's like my bedrock foundation. Within doing that, some of the things, in fact, I was on a program earlier today talking about how diversity and within the portfolio, utilizing diverse managers, they've actually performed very well, right? So just from a policy perspective, making sure that some of the systemic barriers to access to opportunities in the financial services industry is actually counterproductive towards maximizing return and value. And so, so I have focused on that, making sure that we have kind of the best investment managers managing the state's assets, and also making sure that we have diverse managers doing it, because there's just a lot of data that supports how you can increase value in doing that. As a shareholder, so I'm a big believer in ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance factors, looking at your investments through that. And again, data driven, and supporting the notion that you have to look at these things. When I'm investing in managers that invest in developing countries, right? If you tell me you don't care about the governance system in those countries or the companies, I tell you, I don't trust you with managing the money. If you're into real estate and you don't care about environmental issues and how that affects, or you look at through that prism and how that affects our holdings and our investments, I don't want you managing our money.
Especially in Connecticut with cracked foundations.
Exactly. But it all ties together. And so that's been an overriding framework of how we're going to manage risk. And I hired, the first chief risk officer, for, in our state's history to oversee risk. Before the pandemic, when I came into the office, we said, we're going to reposition our whole investment portfolio. We've had this bull market and increasing it, but we started to decrease our exposure to global public equities because I was like, this is not going to last. I had no idea that a pandemic was coming along, but did know in terms of market fundamentals, we've been 10 years in the running. Right. It wasn't going to last. So reposition in order to do that. With respect to, I've talked about gun violence a lot, and I've divested our holdings out of the manufacture of civilian firearms. And first and foremost, they weren't performing well in our portfolio. Beyond that, all the managers said, we can replace those holdings with other securities that perform, have the same risk return characteristics, but without that. I've engaged the financial services industry more broadly to lean into this space and to say, hey, let's have, and by the way, some of this, admittedly, I would love to see federal policy on responsible gun safety. Unfortunately, despite Colorado and the shootings, despite our own Newtown here, despite what happens in urban America every day, despite all of that, you can't get robust national policy on this. And, Senator Murphy and Blumenthal and others, we've been engaged in this fight together. Right. But in the absence of that, once again, I said, what can I do as a state treasurer? My job is about dollars and cents and numbers, right? But as a public official, fundamentally, it's about people. And this was one additional way, engaging the financial services industry to say, hey, if you're going to sell, right, I'm not anti-gun. I think guns are inherently dangerous, but not inherently bad. But if you're going to sell them, how about universal background checks? Overwhelmingly, America wants it. And what's the problem, right? How about a ban on bump stocks? how about like these common sense basic
Red flag laws, etc. Yep.
yes, we've seen so much pain and horror,
Mm-hmm.
and these are not inconsistent with the Second Amendment. But we have enshrined, some have manipulated the Second Amendment to try to restrict the ability of government to responsibly have oversight that saves lives and protects hunters and people who need self-defense. And so that's another way that I have engaged in this. Again, balancing kind of being very responsible from a investment return perspective with, I say, getting a double bottom line.
Right.
And that's what I've tried to do. In the area, we own shares of public corporations throughout America. We leaned in because, again, corporate governance, it's about driving value and what kind of company. We said, let's look at pay equity issues for women. All we're asking for, we want disclosure. We want disclosure on that, right?
Yeah.
Let's look at,
yep.
Right? Let's look at sexual harassment
Mm-hmm.
in the workplace, right? And again, as an investor, I'm saying, well, wait a minute, you've got all these settlements. You're using our money because you have bad oversight, bad policies, bad actors. So
Mm-hmm.
we want to focus on that because we think appropriate oversight means you gotta eliminate or reduce that risk by doing something about this. Climate change. Once again,
Yes.
right? When I go to sell Connecticut bonds, the rating agencies, they have started asking questions about, well, what is the state of Connecticut doing to mitigate the risk of climate change in terms of our state, our economy? But it's the same thing as an investor, as a shareholder. I'm saying to corporations, let's focus on this. This is important to us as shareholders. And I don't do it alone. Typically I'm part of a coalition of investors that we build, across the country to lean in on these issues. But those are some of the ways that I've carried out my responsibilities as a treasurer. And more recently, particularly during COVID-19, let's take a look at essential workers.
Yeah.
And their role in making our economy work for everybody. Yeah. And I am hopeful, again, out of this tragedy of this pandemic, we will have greater respect for the value of frontline workers in our society, whether you're a nurse in a hospital or you're someone at a gas station or a grocery store checkout. Every time
providers, folks, sanitation workers. I mean, so many.
Yes, and we need to look at this as a society, and if you care about kind of growing our economy, increasing opportunities, you can't ignore these types of issues.
I believe firmly that we can hold two ideas at one time, and that the reality is that these are win-wins. Caring for the people in our society who care for us and being financially responsible and being able to make money are not mutually exclusive. And right. I think we see it time and time again, and especially with some of the things that you said. I was lucky enough to serve on the governor's transition team on the women's subcommittee. And one of the recommendations that I had given was the same sort of diversity conversation in terms of we need diverse boards, because it's been proven that there's so much better fiduciary responsibility if you have, just adding women, let alone adding, Black women or Asian women or, whatever, yes. whatever, subset you want to look at. It's the minimalization of financial mistakes, in those companies, because people are more willing to have a dialogue or more willing to speak up, as opposed to just sort of sitting there and just nodding along and it makes such a difference. And I think that, it's the same with the environment. We used to lead the nation in green jobs. We should be leading the nation again in green jobs. There's no reason for that not to happen. We've got offshore wind going. We've got other things in process. And so I'm glad that people are asking, what are we doing? And that this is a growing lens, growing movement, if you will, of making sure that we're all sort of on the same page of leaning into, we can hold these two thoughts that yes, we are a capitalistic society, but also we can do these other things and do them well.
That's exactly right. And my frame and lens of talking about finances and the economy, I think and hope will help drive people to these decisions. You talk about diversity on corporate boards. And so I've been very active in that, both from what's called the 30% Coalition,
Mm-hmm.
which is a coalition dedicated to getting more women on corporate boards, as well as the Northeast Investors Diversity Initiative, a coalition that I lead focused on corporations headquartered in the Northeast. But it's rooted in the data. And we have studies now that show, you look at Fortune 500 companies, and those with no diversity, they underperform their peers with diverse boards, right? And as someone who, always looking at growth and value for pension fund beneficiaries, I'm like, you got to be focused on these things.
Right. Absolutely. And especially because we do have, state money that goes into, driving entrepreneurs, and we've got all these wonderful female entrepreneurs in Connecticut, but making sure, my suggestion was that all the boards be at least 50% women. Now that was sort of pie in the sky, I know, because we need to at least get to 30, but my thought was if we aimed for 50, maybe we'd get to 40. And it is challenging, especially with a lot of the smaller companies, but there are so many women out there who bring such a wealth of, diverse experience and such backgrounds that, it absolutely is something so I'm excited that you are pursuing that.
Yeah. And
critical.
and I'm having these conversations about board diversity, with
Yep.
CEOs who will readily admit, of course, it's better from a
Right.
governance perspective,
Right.
right? Because the idea is to bring different perspectives
Mm-hmm.
into it. I chaired a governance committee of a board where we looked at, and we had all sorts of metrics, geographic diversity, skill set diversity,
Right.
but all of these things you want in the mix, right? And it
Absolutely.
makes a corporation better, right?
Yeah.
And just like society, right? Diversity should be a strength rather than something that divides us. And that's what I see so special about this moment, is that there are more Americans coming together around this moment and this need for change. And I just feel like, we can make a great country even better. And if we actually lean into this moment, embrace it, listen, learn, and act.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is the perfect note for us to finish up on. I think that we've certainly covered a broad range of topics tonight. And again, I just so appreciate your willingness to sit with me tonight and have these conversations, because I think that sometimes I've got our state comptroller Kevin Lembo coming on next week, and I kind of like that you guys are back to back, because I think that it will sort of show the differences between your two positions. But again, any opportunity to sort of educate people on what people in our government do and how, they work for us and with us, it's really critically important. So I thank you so much for being here tonight. It's really great.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so on that note, we're going to say goodnight and catch us again next Tuesday when we talk to Kevin Lembo, same time, 6 p.m. next Tuesday.